Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of This Is My Story. Today we're on location at the home of Dr. Joe McKeever, and this is going to be fun for me. Dr. McKeever has been a pastor for many years and been very well known not only for his work as a pastor but also his work as a cartoonist and as the director of missions in the New Orleans area. And so Dr. McKeever is one of those gentlemen that, well, pastors all over this area and this region know who Dr. McKeever is. So Dr. McKeever, thank you so much for being here with us today.
You're going to have to call me Joe, otherwise this is going to be a very short interview.
Okay, we'll go Joe. We'll go Joe. Well, thank you for allowing us to be at your beautiful home and just kind of be able to talk with you today.
Pleasure.
And so I want to just begin, just for people maybe who don't know you yet, just begin with asking you to tell us your story, your conversion story, and we'll begin there.
I am a son of an Alabama coal miner,
Yeah.
North Alabama, rural. My dad married the farmer's daughter, and Mom was from a godly family, very a great tradition in the Free Will Baptist Church there.
Yeah.
Several generations in that church. That's where I went to church as a child. Came to know the Lord there when I was 11 years old. And what really made the greatest difference in my life after that is 10 years later, I was a college student in Birmingham, and staying for just, the Lord had transferred me there. I'd gone to Berry College for 1 year, and my sister and her husband were moving from Montgomery to Birmingham, and they had a little baby, and James was going to be traveling. So my sister said, if you'll transfer to one of the Birmingham colleges, then you can stay with us, we'll give you free room and board, tell us which college you want to enroll in, we'll move close. So I wanted to be a history professor, so I called up Birmingham Southern. I said, send me an application.
Right.
So we moved close to Birmingham Southern, and we started visiting churches. And one Wednesday night, my brother-in-law said, tonight I thought we'd try West End Baptist Church. And I said, not me. He said, why? I said, have you seen that thing? It's huge. He said, what's wrong with that? I said, big city churches are cold, dead, worldly, formal, and rich. And he said, well, we've got the car. If you go with us.
Yeah.
I said, I'll go once.
Right.
I don't have to tell you, Pastor Chip, that Wednesday night is a throwaway service in a lot of churches. You do not want to make a judgment about the church.
Right.
But I was convinced that this was not going to work. We walked into the sanctuary, and the pastor, John L. Smith, love that name, was doing a Bible study, about 200 adults sitting there, and did a wonderful Bible study. So we're sitting there, and I'm thinking, okay, they teach the word, but I know they're not friendly. This is called prejudice.
Yeah.
And he called on somebody for the benediction and walked back to where we were seated, introduced himself, introduced us to people around there, and found out that Patricia and James, my sister and brother-in-law, had belonged to the choir at their church in Montgomery. He yells across the auditorium to the minister of music, Larry Andrews, who took us on a tour of the music facility that night, and the next night the three of us were seated in choir rehearsal. And on Sunday I fell in with the greatest group of Christian young people I'd ever met. My wife was a high school senior there, and in a period of a little over 3 years, I was baptized there, never had been baptized. I was baptized there, met my wife, called to preach, married, and ordained.
Wow.
The church welcomed a college student. I'm from the Methodist College, Birmingham Southern. Everybody else there went to Samford.
Yeah.
But they treated me like, I was somebody, and I blossomed. I owe it all to West End Baptist Church in Birmingham. And so after that, God called me to preach, and pastored a little church north of town, went to New Orleans Seminary. While I was in New Orleans Seminary, I said, Lord, I'll go anywhere to pastor. Please don't send me to Mississippi. That sounds bad, but what I meant was, in my mind, there was a Baptist church on every street corner in Mississippi.
Right.
I wanted to go where there's a need.
Yeah.
He sent me to Greenville in the Delta, and we pastored in Mississippi for 19 years, Greenville, and then on staff here, First Baptist Jackson for 3 years, and Columbus 12 and a half years. So we were here for 19 years and loved every day of it. My kids grew up in Mississippi. None of them were born here, but if you ask them where they're from, they'll say, I'm from Mississippi.
Yeah. It's neat how God connects us with a local church, the impact of a local church on a person's life. And so, in your case, being from rural Alabama, but being in a local church in Birmingham that you never expected that you would really want to be a part of.
Right.
But But God used that church to really probably help you grow to love church
Yes.
and to really see what church is supposed to be like. And I know as a pastor, I look back on my church experiences, and as a pastor, I take a little bit of all of those churches with me in leading a church. And so it's amazing how impactful a church can be. People don't realize that, I don't think.
That church went out of business probably 20 years ago, changing neighborhood and everything. But every 2 or 3 years, we have a reunion. And there'll be 200 or 300 of us there. We've got one scheduled for September.
Yeah.
And they asked me to lead the meeting, which I just dearly love. But we've got people scattered out through the meeting who are ministers, and, you know, Andy Andrews, the wonderful personality. He was a child there. My wife and I used to babysit him because his dad was our minister of music. And all sorts of people from Weston Baptist Church, touching the world, still touching it, even though that church went out of business 20 years ago.
Just amazing.
Yeah.
Now, so you pastored in different places, but a lot of people know you from your cartoons. I mean, you do a phenomenal job with your cartoons, and of course you do them for Deacons Magazine and sometimes in different other Baptist publications. How did you get into cartooning?
Well, I started drawing cartoons when I was 5. You remember when you were a little kid and you were in your mama's way and she put you at the table and gave you pencil and paper and told you to stay busy?
Right.
Well, I was 5 and my little sister was 3, and Mom put us there and gave us pencil and paper and said, sit there and draw. And what she meant was stay busy and out of my way.
Right.
But I discovered that day I loved to draw, and the next year, when I went to the first grade, Nauvoo, Alabama, the other children would gather around and watch me draw. And to this day, Pastor Chip, I can outdraw any group of first graders you will ever meet. Kept doing it down through the years. And in fact, I was telling a friend this morning that the first cartoon article that I had published for Southern Baptist was 1972 when I was on staff here for Outreach magazine. And it was a cartoon article about witnessing. And I look at those drawings now, I still have the magazine. And I think, holy cow, you thought you could draw? And fortunately, I've worked at it since then, you know, and continue to involve. So sometimes I'll be drawing children, and a child will say, so how many years did it take you to learn to do this? And I say, all of them. And I'm still learning.
Now, what kind of doors has that opened up for you, particularly evangelistically?
Oh, you know, wherever we are, I draw people. And so I'll be in a restaurant or something, you know, and in fact, sometimes we'll be in a restaurant and next door they'll be singing happy birthday to somebody, especially if I'm by myself. Now, you got to get permission from your wife if she's here.
That's right.
But I've been known by myself just to take my pad and walk over and say, who's having a birthday? And they'll find out and they'll say, the restaurant sent me over to draw you. And I'll sit there. I end up drawing everybody in the room and the conversations, you know, and I do this in the breakfast room at hotels and have led a lot of people to the Lord and have made a lot of lasting friends that way.
Wow. Well, I guess, I mean, when somebody receives a drawing that you've done, especially for them, it means a lot to them. It's just a touch in a way. And
you know, I'll tell you this: when I was pastor in Columbus, 1975, I was 35 years old. One day, some girls from the W came over and asked me to help them raise money for a missions project. I said, "What do you want to do?" And they said, "We want to put you in the student center and have you draw students 1 minute for $1." And they said, "We don't care what it looks like." And well, that was great. Well, I was not going to try to draw them funny. I was going to try to draw them well. So you got this line, unending line of these beautiful young women, and I'm trying to draw them in 1 minute. That I had drawn people all my life, but I had never tried to draw them fast.
Yeah.
So ever since then, I have drawn people fast. I'll be drawing in high school sometimes, and I'll have kids time me, and I can do it in about 45 seconds.
Well, I know one of the things that you've done at First Jackson is you've drawn people as they're standing in line for Carols by Candlelight, and that's just to me, that's just a great way of, from your standpoint, this is something that I can do to contribute that makes a difference, that makes things a little bit better. I think it's an incredible thing.
Sometimes I will buy a pack of cardstock at Walmart, you know, 150 sheets in there, and I'll think, you know, in a few days, these sheets are going to be in 150 different homes, and people keep them forever.
That's right.
You know, sometimes I'll hear from somebody, they'll say, at Grandpa's funeral, they put out the display, and here was the picture that you had drawn of him.
Yeah. Wow. I want to touch on a completely different subject with you for a minute. I know that you were director of missions down in the New Orleans area as Katrina was coming through and kind of having to deal with some of that.
Right.
And so, I was at First Biloxi, when that was happening. And so I look back at that time, there are things that you'll never forget, that just memories that stay with you forever.
Right.
But for me, as I look back at that time in my life, that's also a time where I saw God at work in ways that I never imagined that I would. So is there something that you'd like to share with us about that?
Boy, where to start?
Yeah, there's so many.
When I became director of missions, I was 64 years old. I said to them, I'll give you 3 years. They said, give us 5. Well, that was of the Lord, because the first year and a half I went through cancer and radiation. At that time I recovered is when Katrina hit, August of 2005. And of course, as you know, it devastated the Mississippi Gulf Coast, but it basically flooded New Orleans.
Yeah.
It did a lot of hurricane damage, but mostly flooded New Orleans. And so we lost a lot of churches and a lot of neighborhoods, and 1,000 people lost their lives. And we were evacuated for a while. One of the first things that we discovered in the evacuation is that I was talking to one of the pastors, and he was in North Alabama, North Louisiana, and I was in North Alabama. And he said, Joe, we need to try to get our pastors together.
Yeah.
I said, yeah, you're right. So we put it, and the cell phones weren't working down there because the towers were down.
Right.
So we put it out on radios and everything. And I called Stan Buckley, who your predecessor. I said, can we meet at First Baptist Jackson? He said, absolutely. So the next Wednesday, we met at First Baptist Jackson, about 20 pastors. Well, these pastors came in there crying and hugging on each other, and the church fed us lunch. And when it was over, the pastors didn't want to leave. And I realized we have struck on something here. So we started meeting every Wednesday. First Baptist Church of LaPlace, which is 15 miles west of the New Orleans airport, invited us to meet there. They said we didn't have any damage. So for the next 2 years, the pastors met every Wednesday for 3 hours, from 9 until noon, and the church fed us lunch. And the pastors ministered to each other. And that was one of the first things that I realized. I said to a pastor yesterday, Chip, talking about the coronavirus and everything, and he was telling me about the things he was going through. I said, my friend, you need a group of pastors to share with each other, because you're all going through the same thing.
That's right.
And you can help each other, and you won't feel so isolated. Well, that's the first thing we discovered in there. I've got 1,000 stories of things that God did. One of the things He did was, prior to the Katrina, Southern Baptists were kind of looked upon by a lot of people as a cult. But even right after the evacuation, right after we could return to the city, a lot of churches are closed, neighborhoods shut down, but Southern Baptists flooded New Orleans with people and teams and groups of young people, and they were helping, they were feeding people, they were helping to rebuild, they were ministering. These young people go into a restaurant and they would sing, they'd hold hands, they're all wearing t-shirts the same way, and they just blessed so many people. Somebody got on the radio one day, and this person was a Catholic, and he was saying, I don't know where the priests are, but those Southern Baptists, and he used a word that sounds a lot like damn, are all over the place, and God just did amazing things. I've had Southern Baptist pastors say, I never had much use for the denomination, but now Southern Baptists have really rallied. Right. And of course, the disaster relief that Southern Baptists do is right up there with Salvation Army and Red Cross. It is one of the great ministries. Absolutely. There are thousands of people who will be in heaven because of that hurricane, and God's people who came to our area to share their faith in Christ.
So it's amazing how God uses difficult circumstances in life to reveal Himself, and we certainly see His sovereignty and that He works through those things. But, things that we wouldn't want to come into our lives, God uses them for great purposes sometimes.
One of the discoveries I've made, and I often share this with people, is when times are really hard, and when you're discouraged, man, don't quit. That's the time you're about to do your very best service. This is when your gifts are golden, your witness is the strongest, because among other things, the world is watching to see how you handle it. I always think, Chip, about Acts chapter 16, when Paul and Silas are thrown in that prison, and they've been beaten, their backs are open wounds, they're locked in the stocks, they're locked in the interior part of the jail, And the Bible says, Acts chapter 16, verse 25, it says, about midnight, Paul and Silas began singing hymns of praise to God and praying. And the other prisoners were listening. We're always listening. Now, you and I know that Paul did not say, you know, Silas, I just feel like singing. He didn't feel like singing. Sometimes it's like Maya Angelou said, I know why the caged bird sings. Sometimes you just sing because there's nothing else to do. And your service for the Lord, it's like the widow with her little mite. It was pure gold when it arrived in the Lord's coffers.
I've told people a lot, about my experience with Katrina. I don't ever want to have to go through something like that again, but I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.
Yeah. I used to tell these young pastors that I had one young pastor call me while he's still in evacuation. He said, man, I've lost my church. He said, how's this going to look on my record? I said, you don't have a record. I said, you're just serving the Lord. I said, friend, you be faithful, and you will be talking about this for the rest of your life.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I want to transition again because you helped churches go through a tragic time, but you've been through some difficult times of your own, and one of those certainly was the loss of your wife. But you were able to see God's gracious hand there too, and God's provision now being married again. And so talk to us about that. What was that like, losing a spouse, and then how God showed himself and provided again?
Margaret is from Birmingham and grew up in the Southern Baptist Church and everything, and always had some health problems in her adult years, and especially the last 10 or 15 years. We were married 52 years, and none of her health problems were life-threatening. Things like she had Crohn's disease, she had depression, and some other things. And was always just making her rounds of various doctors and everything. In fact, that's one of the reasons that when we retired in 2009, we didn't move to Jackson area. We wanted to. We kept thinking we'd like to move back up here. But I couldn't get her away from her doctors because she needed to stay there and the friends that she had known. Anyway, and so on that Friday morning, January 23 of 2015, I'd gotten up early. When I heard her stirring around there, I made her tea. I put her tea on, and as she came in and sat down there, I poured her a cup of tea, and I had fixed it just the way she liked it. She's not a morning person. I am. And so she sits there, don't talk to her, and just leave her alone. And a little bit, we began to talk, and we sat there for an hour talking. We'd pray together, read scripture together, and talk. A little bit, she said, I'm going to go back to bed. And so when I finished with my blog and then the puzzles in the paper, I went and got a shower, and I'm lying on the bed in the back bedroom about 10 a.m., and she called down the hall and said, I'm going to drive myself down to the nail salon, get a pedicure, and I'll be back. And my last words to my wife of 52 years was, okay. 2 hours later, Oxnard Hospital called and said, sir, we have your wife here. And they wouldn't tell me any more than that. Well, we're down to one car because she had not been driving and just had recently started back. I had to call my daughter-in-law and say, you need to come get me. So she was our pastor's secretary, but she does not work on Friday. So she picked me up, we went, and the doctor said, your wife has had, they thought it was a major heart attack. But that evening, when I stopped at the nail salon to pay the ladies there, because I knew that with all the excitement, nobody had thought about that, they said, sir, we didn't do anything. Said, your wife sat in the chair, coughed a couple of times, and collapsed. And they didn't know what to do. They went next door. These were Vietnamese ladies in the nail salon. And a man came over and called 911. Police station's a half a block away. Fire department is about a half a mile away. They were there immediately. The doctor said, your wife went an hour with no heartbeat. We know she's had major brain damage. We don't know how much. Well, 5 days later, we signed the papers to unplug. We had never had any response from her. And the next day, then she took her last breath. And I came home, and I went in the bedroom that where she'd been living, and I just, with a bag, and I gathered up these pamphlets on various diseases and various conditions that she had and ailments, and I just saying, goodbye Crohn's disease, goodbye depression, goodbye weight gain, goodbye the former things have passed away. I'm crying. Former things have passed away. He's made all things new. And I sat on the floor weeping and just had a revival with the Lord. And when I thought about her in pain, about missing her so bad, I thought I would have brought her back to what she, there were times, but Chip, when she would say, if I knew that it wouldn't hurt my family so bad, I would just take my life, because she lived in constant pain. And so now the Lord has given her relief and brought her into heaven. 1 year later, my son said they were moving to Mobile. He worked for the shipyards, and they'd closed the shipyards in New Orleans since they'd moved his job over to Pascagoula. So he said, we're going to move over to Mobile, and I was not going to be having anybody there. I got a son in North Carolina, a daughter in Missouri. So I started praying, Lord, if you have somebody else for me for the rest of the journey, here's what I would like. So I gave the Lord my order. I said, intelligent, godly, sweet and humble. Attractive is good, but please notice it's number 5. Number 6, learn not having a complication in her personal life like grown kids or lay around the house smoking dope.
Right.
And I thought of number 7. I knew it was nobody I knew. I said, Lord, whoever it is, let us both know this up front so we don't play games. And one day I thought of Bertha. We had never met, Bertha Fagan, the widow of Dr. Gary Fagan. He had died about 8 months before my wife died. Gary and I were in seminary together in New Orleans, and he and I knew each other for 50 years, but I didn't know his family and he didn't know mine.
Yeah.
And when he died in May of 2014, a friend put it on Facebook and said his wife has a page. I went there and left a note, I'm praying and everything, and I clicked on to see if I know his family because we were all in school. And I said, holy smoke, he's married to this beautiful young lady. I should have would remember that. Well, so it was a year after Margaret died that she and I met for the first time.
Yeah.
And we knew that week that God had put us together.
Wow.
Yeah, that week. In fact, I told her the next day after we met, I'm back in New Orleans, she's up here, she was living at Pearl. I told her the 7 things that I had been praying. And she told me she had been writing in her journal 25 reasons why I will never marry again. And the big one was that she had had 50 years married to the greatest guy in the world. What are the chances of Act 2 to follow that? So whenever my family met her, everybody's just falling in love with her because there's nothing not to love.
Absolutely.
And one of my sisters said, Joe, God is rewarding you with Bertha. And my brother said, maybe he is, but the question is, what's he punishing Bertha for?
That's hilarious.
You ought to interview her for some time for this because she's a better interviewer than I am.
Well, but it's just so great. I mean, it's just so incredible to see how God provided not just for you, but also for her. And just a reminder that God knows where we are, and He knows what our needs are, and He's faithful.
We both tell people we're living happily ever after. This deck we are, this is my back deck, but I tell people it's heaven's front porch.
Yeah.
The best place we ever lived, the sweetest time of our lives. God is so good.
That is so fantastic.
Saves the best to last.
That is so fantastic. I want to ask you a question, kind of bringing up to speed to today, because you've been through some difficult things. Of course, we talked about Katrina. We talked about losing your first wife, but you've seen God's hand of faithfulness. And so, for the person who's watching tonight, or maybe even later on in the week, you just sense with people in the midst of this COVID-19, every time you turn on the news, it's negative. Every time you read the newspaper, it's negative.
Yeah.
And it's just one gut punch after another, and it's difficult on people's finances. It's difficult with people's, certainly with mental state. I mean, it's just the depression, the frustration, the things not being normal, not knowing when it's going to end. It's difficult on families. And so a lot of people are going through a difficult time. You've been through some difficult times. You've come through on the other side and seen the faithfulness of God. What would you say to a person who's just right now, just in a cycle of struggle? What would you say to them?
That anybody can serve well when it's easy. But when the going gets tough, that's when your service is pure gold.
Yeah.
That's when it matters most. That's when you're going to have the greatest impact. But you'll get to heaven before you know. You will not know in this life. 2 Corinthians 5:7, we walk by faith and not by sight. You will not know what God is doing until you get to heaven. So Luke 18:8, the Lord Jesus said, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Anybody still living by faith, walking by faith? And I want to raise my hand and say, Lord, here's one. To the best of my knowledge, I will.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say to somebody going through this and somebody having a hard time with the unpredictability of every day. I said, man, just be faithful. Just be faithful. Trust the Lord. And one of these days, you'll be so glad you got it right.
That is so great. You know, I think of David in Psalm 23, and I oftentimes think about how all of Psalm 23 is about the Lord. You know, and so it's clear David's focus is not on the path, his focus is on the shepherd. Mm-hmm. And he just follows the shepherd. Where the shepherd goes, he just follows the shepherd, and he trusts that everything else is going to fall into place. Yeah. And so that's kind of been what you've experienced and what you're saying. I want to just, pastor to pastor, I just want to tap into your wisdom here for a moment, because you've pastored great churches, you've done incredible things, you've been involved with convention and things really all over the country. And so being retired, and of course I know you're still active, you still preach on Sundays as opportunities come, and interims and supply and those kind of things. But now looking back at your ministry and looking at churches where they are today, what do you think is the greatest need in churches? And I say that in general, not specifically First Baptist Jackson, though you certainly could say that, but just in general.
Matthew chapter 10, beginning in verse 16, and the rest of the chapter, this is the Lord's instructions to his disciples as he was sending them out they were going out to trial preach. Yeah. And it was going to be tough. And he said, some of you are going to be arrested, some of you are going to be put on trial. So these are his instructions for the rest of the journey. Now the earlier part of that chapter is in Matthew chapter 10. The earlier part, he's telling them to raise the dead and heal the sick and cast out demons. But from verse 16 on to the end of the chapter is his instructions for the church for the rest of the journey. And he's telling them it's going to be tough. Buckle up. Turbulence ahead. I'm going to be with you. I want you to speak up. I want you to stand up. I don't want any secret agents. I don't want any undercover Christians. I want you to go public and be strong. And he ends at the end by saying, and if you give it even a cup of cold water in the name of a disciple, you will not lose your reward. So even the smallest gift, he says, you be faithful and you're going to receive a reward. So I would just say, get into the Word. Christian, get into the Word. Don't, the greatest lie, that Satan has two great lies about the Word. One lie is, you already know this Bible, don't read it. And the truth is, you don't know it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I've been pastoring since 1962, and you've been pastoring a little less than that. You don't know this word. You know a lot about it, but there's so much you don't know. So he's a liar. The other lie he tells is nobody can know this word. It's too deep, or it's contradictory, whatever. And he is also a liar. Jesus said in John 8, he's a liar and the father of lies. So get into it, live in the Word, and you'll be amazed what God will do. And the closer you get to the Lord, the less you will know it. Other people will look at you and say, wow, and you're such a great Christian, and you'll think, not me, not me. Yeah. When I was on staff here, I interviewed Marguerite Briscoe. She was 78 years old, retired elementary school principal, and a single lady, a dear, dear Christian woman. I said to her one day, Marguerite, you are the greatest Christian that I know. And she said, oh, honey, if you just knew. I do know. I know that the closer you get to the light, the more imperfections you see. Mm-hmm. And the farther you're away from the light, the better you feel about yourself.
That's right. That's exactly right. Listen, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I've enjoyed this very much personally, and I know that people who are watching enjoy it as well. So thank you for opening up your home. Thank you for being willing to talk.
May I just say that Bertha and I love you very much, and we're so proud to have Chip Stevens as our pastor.
Well, you are very kind. It certainly is an honor. It certainly is. And listen, we want to thank you for joining us tonight again. You've heard an incredible story of the faithfulness of the Lord. And you've learned how God does bring us through difficult times, but you've also learned that it's important how we handle those difficult times. And Joe's story is a story of being faithful and seeking the Lord and seeing God be faithful to him over and over and over again. And what a great reminder there at the end. You know, the importance of coming to the Word of God. We don't know the answers to a lot of questions. We don't know what tomorrow is going to look like. We don't know what 10 years from now is going to look like. But we can know the Lord. God has revealed himself to us in his Word. We can know him. We can be faithful to him. So it's important that we focus on what we can do and that we trust in him and his faithfulness, as you've heard in This Is My Story today. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Hope that you'll join us again next week, and I hope that you have a great week this week. Thank you.